The rain fell like tears from a gray sky as Marcus Chun stood at the edge of Riverside Cemetery, watching the last of the mourners drift away from Sarah's grave. His wife of 12 years lay beneath fresh earth and white roses, taken too soon by the cancer that had eaten through her lungs despite every treatment the colony's medical center could provide. The black suit hung loose on his frame, weight lost during the months of watching her fade away, meal by meal, breath by breath. Marcus had served 8 tours across 3 different worlds during the Terran Hegemony War, survived plasma burns, and shrapnel wounds that should have killed him twice over. But nothing had prepared him for this kind of loss. Sarah had been his anchor, the voice that called him home through subspace communications during the worst battles. Now that voice was silent forever. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking New Geneva, one of humanity's newer colony worlds in the Centauri sector. Down in the valley, the city's lights began to flicker on as evening approached. Hover traffic moved in orderly streams between the glass towers and residential blocks. It looked peaceful from up here, almost like the cities back on Earth that Marcus remembered from his childhood. A low hum drew his attention skyward. A hegemony patrol craft descended through the clouds, its sleek purple hull gleaming despite the overcast weather. The ship bore the triple star insignia of the Valdari hegemony, the alien alliance that controlled this sector of space. Humanity existed here only through a series of treaties that grew more restrictive each year. Marcus watched the craft circle once before landing in the cemetery's parking area. 3 figures emerged, their tall, slender forms immediately recognizable as Valdari. They wore the dark blue uniforms of the Colonial Oversight Division, the branch responsible for monitoring human activities on hegemony worlds. The lead officer's skin had the pale blue tint typical of his species, and his large black eyes surveyed the cemetery with the cold efficiency Marcus remembered from his military days. Human designation Marcus Chun, the lead officer called out in accented standard. His voice carried the musical quality common to Valdari's speech, though it sounded harsh when delivering orders. You are in violation of Assembly Regulation 847-C. Public gatherings of more than 5 humans require advance permit approval. Marcus turned slowly, his hands remaining visible at his sides. Years of military training had taught him to read alien body language, and these 3 were tense, ready for trouble. The lead officer carried a neural disruptor at his hip, while his companions flanked out to cover potential escape routes. This was a funeral, Marcus said quietly. My wife's funeral. There are maybe 20 people here, all family and friends paying their respects. Irrelevant, the officer replied, his head tilting in the way Valdari did when they considered humans particularly dim. Regulation 847-C makes no exceptions for human emotional rituals. You organized an unpermitted gathering. The penalty is neural disruption and 72 hours of corrective detention. The other 2 Valdari moved closer, their hands resting on their weapons. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, a familiar sensation from his combat days. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his wife's funeral, the place where he'd just laid her to rest, and these aliens wanted to punish him for grieving with friends. Officer, I understand there are regulations, Marcus began, keeping his voice level. But surely there's some discretion here. These people just came to honor a woman who died of cancer. They're already leaving. No one's causing trouble. The lead Valdari's large eyes narrowed. You question hegemony authority, human? Perhaps you require additional corrective measures. He reached for his neural disruptor, a weapon Marcus knew well from his military service. The device could render a human unconscious instantly or cause excruciating pain without permanent damage, depending on the setting. Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. 8 tours of duty, countless battles against hegemony forces before the treaty, and now he had to stand here and accept punishment for burying his wife. The irony tasted bitter in his mouth. He'd fought to protect human colonies from alien oppression, only to watch that same oppression slowly strangle the worlds he'd died to defend. I'm not questioning your authority, Marcus said through gritted teeth. I'm asking for basic decency. My wife died 3 days ago. Today was her funeral. These people came to support me through the worst day of my life. Human emotional responses are not relevant to hegemony law, the officer stated, drawing his weapon. The neural disruptor hummed as it powered up, its blue-white energy core casting strange shadows across the gravestones. You will comply with detention protocols immediately. Around them, the last few humans at the cemetery stopped to stare. Marcus recognized Tom Bradley, who'd served under him during the Battle of Kepler Station. Linda Morrison, Sarah's closest friend since college. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who'd fought to save Sarah's life right until the end. They all watched with the same helpless expression Marcus had seen too often on human faces over the past 5 years since the treaty. The lead Valdari raised his weapon, aiming it at Marcus's chest. Final warning, human. Submit to detention or face enhanced neural disruption. Marcus looked down at Sarah's grave one more time. The roses were already wilting in the rain, their white petals scattered across the dark earth. She'd been so proud of his service record, the medals and commendations he'd earned fighting for human independence. What would she think of him now, standing here about to be stunned unconscious by the same species he'd once battled? "You want to arrest me for attending my wife's funeral," Marcus said slowly, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "For saying goodbye to the woman I loved." "Correct," the Valdari officer replied. "Compliance is required." Marcus straightened his shoulders, feeling something shift inside his chest. The grief was still there, the crushing weight of loss that made every breath an effort. But underneath it, something else was stirring, something hot and angry that reminded him of the man he'd been before the treaty, before humanity had agreed to become a subject species. "Then, go ahead," Marcus said, spreading his arms wide. "Stun an unarmed human veteran at his wife's grave. Show everyone here exactly what hegemony justice looks like." The Valdari officer's finger tightened on the trigger. The neural disruptor's hum rose to a whine as energy built up in its capacitors. Around the cemetery, the remaining humans watched in silence, bearing witness to what was about to happen. Marcus closed his eyes and thought of Sarah's smile, the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day 12 years ago. If this was how it ended, at least he'd go down standing up instead of kneeling like so many humans had learned to do. The weapon fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the tombstones. Blue-white energy lanced out, striking Marcus in the chest and sending neural fire racing through his nervous system. He collapsed to his knees beside Sarah's grave, every muscle in his body convulsing as the disruptor did its work. Through the haze of pain, he heard Dr. Warren scream. Someone was running toward him, but the Valdari officers were already moving to intercept. More weapons were being drawn. The situation was escalating exactly as Marcus had known it would. As consciousness faded, Marcus managed one last thought. Sarah would have told him to be smarter, to pick his battles more carefully. But sometimes a man had to make a stand, even if it was the wrong time and place. Especially then. The last thing he heard before the neural fire claimed him was the sound of hover engines in the distance, growing louder by the second. The neural fire burning through Marcus Chin's nervous system began to fade as consciousness slowly returned. He found himself lying face down in the wet grass beside Sarah's grave, rain pattering against his back. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry, a familiar sensation from his military days. Neural disruptors were designed to incapacitate without permanent damage, but they left their victims feeling like they'd been trampled by a mechanized unit. Voices drifted through the haze of recovery. The Valdari officers were speaking in their own language, those melodic tones that sounded beautiful until you learned they were usually discussing the most efficient ways to subjugate entire populations. Marcus forced himself to remain still, drawing on old training about surviving capture. Let them think he was still unconscious while he gathered intelligence about the situation. The human's neural patterns indicate consciousness returning, one of the Valdari said in Standard, apparently for the benefit of the remaining humans. Prepare detention restraints. Please, Dr. Warren's voice cut through the rain. He just buried his wife. Can't you show some compassion? Human emotional responses are irrelevant to law enforcement protocols, came the cold reply from the lead officer. This subject organized an illegal gathering and showed disrespect for hegemony authority. Corrective detention is required. Marcus cracked one eye open slightly, trying to assess the tactical situation without alerting his captors. The three Valdari officers stood in a rough triangle around him, their weapons drawn but not actively aimed. Beyond them, perhaps a dozen humans remained scattered across the cemetery, all watching with a mixture of fear and anger that Marcus had seen too often over the past 5 years. What caught his attention, however, was the growing sound of hover engines approaching from multiple directions. The Valdari had apparently noticed it too, their large heads turning skyward as they tracked the incoming aircraft. Their body language shifted subtly, the relaxed confidence of moments before replaced by alertness. Identify incoming vehicles, the lead officer commanded into his communication device. After a moment, he repeated the request with greater urgency. Central Command, we require identification of multiple human aircraft approaching cemetery location. The response must not have been what he expected, because all three aliens suddenly raised their weapons and formed a defensive perimeter. Whatever was coming, it wasn't part of their plan. Marcus risked opening his eyes fully and immediately understood why the Valdari were concerned. 6 human military hovercraft were descending through the clouds, their angular black hulls bearing the distinctive markings of the Colonial Defense Corps. More importantly, these weren't the lightly armed patrol vessels that humanity was permitted under the treaty. These were full military assault transports, the kind designed to deploy heavy infantry in contested zones. The lead craft touched down at the far end of the cemetery with surprising gentleness for such a large vehicle. Its rear ramp dropped immediately, and figures in powered armor began disembarking at a run. Marcus blinked water from his eyes, certain he was hallucinating. The armor was Marine Corps patterned, the real thing, not the ceremonial gear that human forces were allowed for parades and memorial services. This is Valdari Colonial Officer Jerix Ka to all human aircraft. The lead alien spoke into his communicator with obvious strain. You are in violation of Treaty Article 15, Section 7. Military deployments require advance authorization. Return to base immediately. The response came not from the communicator, but from an external speaker on the nearest transport. This is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, commanding officer of the 3rd Colonial Marine Regiment. We are conducting a lawful memorial service for fallen personnel. Stand down your weapons immediately. Jarek Ska's pale, blue skin darkened with what Marcus recognized as Valdari anger. Humans are not authorized for armed memorial services. This gathering was already determined to be illegal. Withdraw your forces or face the consequences. Negative, came the crisp reply. Article 23 of the Terran Colonial Charter guarantees the right of military personnel to honor their fallen with appropriate ceremony. Sergeant Major Marcus Chun served with distinction for 8 years, including 3 tours under my direct command. His wife, Sarah Chun, served as a medical technician attached to Marine units during the Kepler Station campaign. They both earned the right to a proper farewell. Marcus felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with residual neural disruption. These weren't just random Marines. These were his people, soldiers he'd served alongside during some of the worst fighting humanity had seen. And they'd come for him. The Valdari officers were clearly out of their depth. 3 colonial oversight troops with neural disruptors against an entire Marine company in powered armor represented the kind of tactical mismatch that usually ended very badly for the smaller force. But backing down now would represent a loss of face that their rigid hierarchy couldn't tolerate. Human forces will withdraw immediately, Jerix Ka commanded, though his voice carried less confidence than before. This human is under detention for violations of Assembly Regulation 847C. Interference with lawful hegemony operations constitutes an act of rebellion. More Marines were deploying from the other transports now, moving with the fluid precision that Marcus remembered from his own service. They weren't pointing weapons at the Valdari, but their positions were clearly chosen to provide overlapping fields of fire should the situation deteriorate. These were professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Colonel Mitchell's voice carried clearly across the cemetery as she approached on foot. Marcus turned his head enough to see her, a compact woman with graying hair and the kind of scars that came from leading from the front. He remembered her from the siege of Prometheus Colony, where she'd held off a hegemony assault for 6 days with nothing but a company of Marines and whatever they could scavenge from the ruins. Officer Jerixka, she said formally, coming to a stop 10 meters away. I'm going to explain the situation very clearly, so there's no misunderstanding. Sergeant Major Chun just buried his wife after watching her die slowly from radiation poisoning she received during her service to humanity. The people here came to honor both of them. If you have a problem with humans mourning their dead, you're welcome to discuss it with my Marines. The Valdari officer's weapon wavered slightly as he tracked between Mitchell and the armored figures spreading out across the cemetery. The Treaty of Proxima clearly states that human military forces are restricted to designated bases and cannot be deployed without hegemony authorization. The Treaty of Proxima also states that humans retain the right to conduct military funerals according to established tradition. Mitchell replied evenly. Article 23, subsection 12. I have a copy if you'd like to review it. Marcus slowly pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his abused nervous system. The neural disruptor had done its work thoroughly, but he was functional enough to understand what was happening. This wasn't just about him, or even about Sarah. This was about drawing a line, making it clear that some things were still sacred to humanity even under alien occupation. You cannot deploy armed forces to intimidate hegemony personnel, Jerixka insisted, though he was backing away now as more Marines moved into position. This constitutes a violation of colonial accords. These Marines are here to honor fallen comrades and ensure that memorial services can be conducted without harassment, Mitchell stated. If you interpret that as intimidation, perhaps you should examine your own actions. The standoff stretched out across several tense seconds while Marcus struggled back to his feet. Dr. Warren moved to help him, but he waved her off. This was his moment to stand, whatever it cost him. Around the cemetery, he could see more humans emerging from hiding places among the trees and monuments. Word was spreading that someone had finally said no to hegemony bullying. Stand down your weapons, Mitchell commanded the Valdari officers. This is a place of mourning, not a battlefield. Show some respect for the dead. Marcus found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. Colonel Mitchell. She turned toward him, and he managed something approaching military bearing despite the tremors running through his limbs. Thank you for coming. Sarah would have appreciated this. Sarah earned it, Sergeant Major, Mitchell replied. As did you. She looked back at the Valdari officers. Gentlemen, you have exactly 30 seconds to holster your weapons and leave this cemetery. After that, I'll consider your presence here a desecration of sacred ground. Jerixka's large black eyes darted between the assembled Marines and his own meager force. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. 3 aliens with sidearms against a full company of humanity's best soldiers in powered armor represented the kind of tactical impossibility that even Valdari arrogance couldn't overcome. This incident will be reported to Central Command, he said finally, his weapon lowering with obvious reluctance. There will be consequences for this violation. I'm sure there will be, Mitchell agreed. But not today. Today we bury our dead with dignity. As the Valdari officers retreated toward their patrol craft, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. 4 or 5 years since the treaty, humanity had bent its neck and accepted whatever indignities the hegemony chose to impose. Today, for the first time, someone had said no. The real test was yet to come. The Valdari patrol craft lifted off from the cemetery parking area with the kind of hurried departure that Marcus recognized from his military days. When aliens started retreating faster than tactical doctrine required, it usually meant they were rushing back to report something their superiors wouldn't want to hear. In this case, that something was a direct challenge to hegemony authority by human military forces. Colonel Mitchell watched the craft disappear into the gray clouds before turning back to the assembled Marines. First Sergeant Rodriguez, establish a perimeter. I want early warning if they come back with reinforcements. She looked toward Marcus, who was still struggling with the aftereffects of neural disruption. Medical team to the grave site. Sergeant Major Chun needs attention. I'm functional, Colonel, Marcus protested, though his voice still carried the tremor that came with nerve damage. Just need a few minutes to shake it off. That wasn't a request, Sergeant Major, Mitchell replied with the kind of tone that ended discussions. Doc Martinez, check him over. I need to know if that neural disruptor caused any permanent damage. A Marine medic in powered armor jogged over, his suit's medical sensors already scanning Marcus before he'd even arrived. Elevated neural stress patterns, muscle fasciculation consistent with disruptor exposure, but nothing that won't heal with time, he reported after a moment. Sir, you're going to feel like hell for the next few hours, but there's no permanent damage. Around them, the atmosphere in the cemetery had shifted dramatically. Where minutes before there had been the oppressive weight of alien occupation, now there was something Marcus hadn't felt since before the treaty. Pride. The remaining civilians stood straighter, talked louder, looked the Marines in the eye instead of staring at the ground. It was amazing what a difference hope could make. Dr. Warren approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on the powered armor surrounding them. Colonel Mitchell, what happens when the Valdari come back? This cemetery isn't a civilian sector. If they bring military forces, then we'll deal with that situation when it develops, Mitchell replied calmly. Right now, we're conducting a memorial service for fallen personnel. Nothing in the colonial treaty prohibits that. But the assembly regulation they mentioned, Tom Bradley interjected. He'd been Marcus's second-in-command during the Kepler Station siege and knew military law well enough to spot potential problems. The one about unauthorized gatherings. They'll use that as justification for whatever comes next. Mitchell's expression hardened slightly. Assembly Regulation 847C was passed by colonial government under duress, using authority they didn't legally possess. The Terran Colonial Charter supersedes any local regulation that conflicts with basic human rights. That includes the right to mourn our dead. Marcus found himself studying the colonel's face, reading the subtext behind her words. This wasn't just about funeral protocols or legal technicalities. This was about drawing lines and testing boundaries. For 5 years, humanity had retreated step by step, regulation by regulation, until basic human dignity had become a privilege that aliens could revoke at will. Someone had finally decided that the retreat ended here. Colonel, Marcus said quietly, with respect, this is bigger than just a funeral now. When they come back, and they will come back, it won't be 3 oversight officers with sidearms. It'll be combat troops with heavy weapons. I'm aware of that, Sergeant Major, Mitchell acknowledged. Which is why we need to make this count. Every human on this world is watching what happens here today. They need to see that we haven't forgotten how to stand up for ourselves. The sound of approaching aircraft interrupted the conversation. This time, it wasn't the musical hum of Valdari hover technology, but the deeper rumble of human military engines. Marcus looked up to see 3 more transports descending through the clouds, these ones bearing the markings of different colonial defense units. The 7th Engineer Battalion and 12th Support Company, Mitchell observed with satisfaction. Right on schedule. You planned this, Marcus realized. This wasn't a spontaneous response to a distress call. You knew this was going to happen. Mitchell turned toward him with a slight smile. Sergeant Major, human intelligence networks on this world are more extensive than the Valdari imagine. We knew they'd been watching the funeral preparations, looking for an excuse to flex their authority. Officer Jerichka has a history of harassing human gatherings, particularly those involving military veterans. The new arrivals began disembarking immediately, but these weren't just combat troops. Marcus could see engineering equipment, communications gear, and what looked suspiciously like portable defensive emplacements. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. This was a military occupation of the cemetery. "Ma'am," First Sergeant Rodriguez called out from his position near the perimeter. "Valdari communication traffic is spiking across all monitored frequencies. They're definitely calling for reinforcements." "Expected," Mitchell replied. "How long do we have?" "Based on standard hegemony response protocols, maybe 2 hours before they can get significant forces here. But, Colonel, they have orbital assets. If they decide this is serious enough." Mitchell nodded grimly. "Then, we make sure it doesn't come to that. This stays ground level, civilian authority versus civilian authority. The moment it escalates to military response, we're in treaty violation territory." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Orbital assets meant ships in space, weapons that could turn this entire area into radioactive glass without warning. The Valdari had used such tactics before during the war, demonstrating their willingness to employ overwhelming force against human resistance. "Colonel, maybe we should consider withdrawal," Dr. Warren suggested nervously. "If this escalates beyond what the treaty can contain." "Doctor, the treaty has been eroding human rights for 5 years," Mitchell replied sharply. "Every time we back down, every time we accept reasonable restrictions on our freedom, we lose a little more of what makes us human. Today we find out where the line is." Around the cemetery, Marines were setting up equipment with practiced efficiency. Communication relays went online, linking them to networks across the colonial territories. Defensive positions were established among the trees and monuments, carefully placed to avoid damaging any graves. Whatever was coming, they were preparing to meet it. Marcus walked slowly towards Sarah's grave, his legs still unsteady from the neural disruption. The white roses lay scattered across the fresh earth, some already trampled during the confrontation. He knelt carefully and began gathering them up, his hands shaking slightly from nerve damage. "She would have liked this," he said quietly to Colonel Mitchell, who had followed him. "Sarah always said humanity's greatest strength wasn't our weapons or our technology. It was our refusal to give up on each other." "She was right," Mitchell agreed. "And that's why we're here. Every human on New Geneva needs to know that someone still remembers how to say no." In the distance, the rumble of approaching Valdari aircraft was beginning to filter through the clouds. Heavier engines this time, military craft that meant serious business. The real test was about to begin, and Marcus found himself thinking about all the battles he'd fought during the war. None of them had felt as important as this moment, standing beside his wife's grave while two species prepared to determine the future of human dignity. The storm was coming, and this time there would be no strategic withdrawal. The Valdari return came exactly 93 minutes after their initial retreat, announced by the thunderous roar of heavy military craft descending through the storm clouds. Marcus watched from behind a temporary barricade that Marines had constructed between two large mausoleums, his hands finally steady enough to grip the combat rifle that First Sergeant Rodriguez had pressed into his hands despite Colonel Mitchell's protests. "Sergeant Major, you're a civilian now," Mitchell had argued. "You don't need to be part of this fight." "Ma'am, with respect, they made it my fight when they stunned me at my wife's grave," Marcus had replied. "Besides, you're going to need every experienced soldier you can get." Now, watching 12 Valdari assault craft settle into attack formation around the cemetery, Marcus wondered if experience would be enough. The aliens had brought serious firepower this time, not just oversight officers with neural disruptors. These were hegemony combat engineers, the troops responsible for pacifying rebellious populations across a dozen star systems. "Contact front," called out Sergeant Kim from his position near the main gate. Valdari ground forces deploying in company strength. "I count approximately 60 combat troops with heavy weapon support." Colonel Mitchell's voice carried clearly over the tactical network. "All units, this is Sierra 6. Remember your rules of engagement. We are conducting a lawful memorial service under Article 23 of the Colonial Charter. We will not fire first, but we will defend ourselves if attacked. Make every shot count. Through his rifle scope, Marcus could see the Valdari forming up beyond the cemetery's perimeter fence. Their powered armor was sleeker than human designs, built for their taller, more slender physiology, but he knew from experience that it was just as effective at stopping projectiles. The real problem was their numerical advantage and superior positioning. The cemetery provided good cover, but it also meant the Marines were surrounded with limited options for tactical withdrawal. A new voice cut across the Valdari communication frequencies, speaking an accented standard that Marcus's translation software picked up clearly. Human military forces, this is Hegemony Combat Commander Zekvar. You are in violation of Treaty Article 15 and Colonial Assembly Regulation 847C. Surrender immediately or face the consequences of armed resistance. Mitchell's response was broadcast on all frequencies, ensuring that every human communication device in the city could hear her words. Commander Zekvar, this is Colonel Sarah Mitchell of the Terran Colonial Defense Corps. We are conducting a memorial service for fallen personnel under authorities granted by the Terran Colonial Charter. Your forces are trespassing on sacred ground during a religious ceremony. Withdraw immediately. The Valdari commander's reply carried the kind of cold arrogance that Marcus remembered from the war years. Human religious practices hold no authority under hegemony law. You have 60 seconds to surrender your weapons and submit to detention. After that, we will consider this an act of rebellion. Around the cemetery, Marcus could see civilians taking shelter behind monuments and maintenance buildings. Many were using personal communication devices to record what was happening, broadcasting the confrontation live to networks across the colonial territories. Whatever happened next will be witnessed by millions of humans across dozens of worlds. 30 seconds. Dr. Warren whispered from her position behind a nearby headstone. Colonel, they're not bluffing. I've seen what hegemony forces do to human resistance movements. So have I, Doctor, Mitchell replied grimly. Which is why we're not going to let them turn us into one. Marcus felt something shift in the tactical situation as the deadline approached. Through his scope, he could see Valdari troops adjusting their positions, preparing for assault. Combat engineers were setting up heavy weapons that could punch through any cover the cemetery might provide. In space above them, orbital platforms were probably already tracking the site, ready to turn it into a crater if ground forces failed to restore order. 10 seconds, someone called out over the network. Marcus thought about Sarah, about the life they'd built together on this world, about the future they'd planned before cancer stole it away. He thought about 8 years of military service, fighting to protect human colonies from exactly this kind of oppression. Most of all, he thought about what it meant to be human in a galaxy that considered humanity a subject species. Time, Commander Zekvar announced. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Valdari and human forces faced each other across the cemetery's perimeter, weapons raised, but not yet firing. The rain continued to fall, pattering against armor and headstones with equal indifference to the drama unfolding beneath it. Then, Marcus heard something that changed everything. Vehicle engines, approaching fast from multiple directions. Not military craft this time, but civilian transports, hundreds of them by the sound of it. Hover cars, cargo haulers, emergency vehicles, even construction equipment, all converging on the cemetery from across New Geneva. What the hell? First Sergeant Rodriguez muttered, scanning the approaching convoy through his rifle scope. The answer came from Colonel Mitchell's communication officer. Ma'am, we're receiving multiple transmissions from civilian sources. Looks like every human on this continent is heading this way. They're calling it a solidarity march. Marcus lowered his rifle and stared as the first wave of civilian vehicles crested the hill below the cemetery. Hundreds of humans were pouring out of cars and transports, walking up the road toward the confrontation. They weren't armed, weren't wearing armor, but they kept coming anyway. Teachers and factory workers, doctors and mechanics, children and grandparents all walking together through the rain toward a potential battle zone. Impossible, he heard Commander Zekvar say over the communication frequencies. Humans do not engage in collective resistance behavior. Individual compliance is hardwired into their species' psychology. Colonel Mitchell's laugh carried clearly across the tactical network. Commander, I think you've been reading the wrong intelligence reports. The civilians reached the cemetery's outer perimeter and simply kept walking, flowing around the Valdari positions like water around rocks. They weren't attacking, weren't threatening anyone, but their presence fundamentally altered the tactical situation. 60 armed aliens facing 40 Marines was one thing. 60 aliens facing 40 Marines plus 10,000 civilians was something else entirely. All Valdari units, maintain position, Zekvar commanded, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Do not engage civilian targets unless directly threatened. Marcus watched through his scope as the crowd continued to grow. News crews were arriving now, broadcasting live footage to networks across human space. Whatever happened here would be seen by billions of people, recorded for history. The hegemony could suppress individual incidents, cover up isolated resistance, but they couldn't hide a planet-wide demonstration of human solidarity. Sergeant Major, Colonel Mitchell called out, I think your wife would have been proud to see this. Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Sarah had always believed that humans were stronger together than apart, that their greatest weapon against oppression was simply refusing to accept it. Looking at the thousands of people walking through the rain to stand with them, he finally understood what she'd meant. The standoff was about to become something much larger than anyone had anticipated. For the first time in 5 years, an entire world was about to tell the hegemony no. The rain had stopped by the time the sun began to set over Riverside Cemetery, but the crowd had not. If anything, more humans continued to arrive as word spread across New Geneva and beyond. Marcus estimated at least 15,000 people now surrounded the cemetery, creating a human barrier between the Valdari combat troops and the Marines who had come to honor the dead. From his position near Sarah's grave, Marcus could see the tactical situation had evolved into something unprecedented. The Valdari forces remained in their assault positions, weapons ready, but they were completely surrounded by civilians who showed no signs of leaving. Children played games between the headstones while their parents kept vigil. Elderly humans sat in folding chairs they'd brought from home, prepared for a long wait. Food vendors had even appeared, turning the standoff into an impromptu festival of resistance. Commander Zekvar had been receiving increasingly urgent communications from his superiors throughout the afternoon. Marcus's suit could intercept fragments of the encrypted Valdari transmissions, and the tone was becoming decidedly hostile. Hegemony Central Command was not pleased with the situation on New Geneva. Human forces, Zekvar's voice crackled across the communication frequencies. You have created an untenable situation. Withdraw your troops immediately or face orbital bombardment of the entire cemetery complex. Colonel Mitchell's response was broadcast on every civilian frequency, ensuring that the thousands of gathered humans could hear her words. Commander, are you seriously threatening to murder 15,000 unarmed civilians because they came to attend a funeral? The silence that followed stretched for nearly a full minute. Around the cemetery, humans looked up at the sky, knowing that somewhere above the clouds, hegemony warships were probably already targeting the area. Marcus thought about the orbital strikes he'd witnessed during the war, the way entire city blocks could be vaporized in seconds without warning. The hegemony does not negotiate with terrorist organizations, Zekvar finally replied, though his voice carried less confidence than before. These aren't terrorists, Commander, came a new voice on the communication network. Marcus looked up in surprise as he recognized the speaker. This is Governor Patricia Williams, elected representative of the New Geneva colonial government. I'm standing here with 15,000 of my constituents who came to pay their respects to fallen heroes. If you want to call that terrorism, You'll need to explain it to the Galactic Council. Marcus could see the governor now, a gray-haired woman in a simple black dress walking through the crowd toward the Marine's position. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 30 years in politics, unafraid of either alien weapons or media attention. Behind her came other figures that Marcus recognized from news broadcasts, including several members of the Colonial Assembly. Governor Williams, Colonel Mitchell said formally as the politician approached. "Thank you for coming." "Colonel, my apologies for the delay. It took some time to coordinate with the other colonial governments, but I think you'll find the wait was worthwhile." As if summoned by her words, new communication signals began flooding the tactical network. Voices from across human space, each identifying themselves as elected representatives of different colonial worlds. Within minutes, Marcus was listening to messages from governors, mayors, and assembly members representing over 40 human colonies scattered across a dozen star systems. This is Governor Chun of the Kepler colonies, expressing full support for the actions of Colonel Mitchell and her Marines. Governor Martinez of the Centauri Republic stands with our brothers and sisters on New Geneva. The elected government of the Ross system condemns hegemony interference with human funeral rights. The messages kept coming, creating a cascade of political support that was being broadcast live across the galaxy. What had begun as a local incident at a small cemetery was rapidly becoming a diplomatic crisis involving the entire human colonial network. Commander Zekvar's voice cut across the transmissions, sharp with anger. "These political statements are irrelevant. Colonial governments have no authority to override hegemony security operations." "Actually, Commander, they do," Governor Williams replied calmly. "Article 12 of the Treaty of Proxima specifically reserves to colonial governments the right to regulate cultural and religious practices within their jurisdictions. Memorial services for fallen military personnel fall under that authority." Marcus watched through his scope as Valdari officers huddled around their command post, clearly receiving new instructions from their superiors. The political situation was spiraling beyond their ability to control through force alone. Orbital bombardment of 15,000 civilians under the watch of news crews from across the galaxy would create exactly the kind of diplomatic incident that could destabilize the entire hegemony colonial structure. Colonel Mitchell came a new voice on the tactical network. This one carried the authority of serious rank. "This is Admiral Harrison, commanding the Terran Colonial Fleet. What's your tactical assessment?" Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Admiral Harrison commanded the largest human naval force still permitted under the treaty, consisting of patrol ships and defensive platforms scattered across the colonial territories. If the fleet was getting involved, this situation had escalated far beyond anyone's original intentions. "Admiral, we have approximately 40 Marines in defensive positions within the cemetery, surrounded by 15,000 civilians and 60 Valdari combat troops," Mitchell reported crisply. "No shots fired yet, but Commander Zekvar has threatened orbital bombardment if we don't withdraw." "Understood, Colonel. Be advised that hegemony orbital platforms have indeed acquired targeting locks on your position. However, they also have 18 human naval vessels tracking them from extreme range. Any orbital bombardment will be considered an act of war against the colonial defense fleet." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. The fleet was prepared to fight, something that hadn't happened since the treaty ended active hostilities 5 years ago. Whatever began here could spread across the entire galaxy, reigniting a war that had already cost millions of lives. "Admiral, with respect, this doesn't need to escalate that far," Mitchell replied carefully. "We're just trying to bury our dead with dignity." "I understand, Colonel, but sometimes dignity is worth fighting for." Around the cemetery, the crowd had grown silent as people listened to the exchange on their personal communication devices. Marcus could see the weight of decision settling on thousands of faces as humans across the galaxy realized they were witnessing a moment that would define their species' future relationship with the hegemony. Commander Zekvar's voice returned, but the arrogance was gone now, replaced by careful diplomatic language. Admiral Harrison, the hegemony has no desire to resume hostilities over this incident. Perhaps we can reach a reasonable accommodation. I'm listening, Commander. The human military personnel will be permitted to complete their memorial service without further interference. In return, colonial defense forces will withdraw to their designated bases and normal treaty protocols will resume. Marcus looked toward Colonel Mitchell, who was studying the crowd of civilians around them. These people had risked everything to stand with the Marines, walking into a potential battle zone because they believed something was worth defending. The decision she made now would determine whether their courage meant anything. Commander Zekvar, Mitchell said finally, the memorial service will proceed as planned, with full military honors for Sergeant Major and Mrs. Chun. The civilians will be allowed to participate without harassment. Any future interference with human funeral rites will be considered a violation of Article 12 and dealt with accordingly. Agreed, came the reluctant reply. As Marcus watched, the Valdari combat troops began withdrawing to their transports. Their mission failed not through force of arms, but through the simple refusal of an entire world to accept injustice. Around the cemetery, the crowd began to cheer, a sound that carried across the hills and into the city below. Marcus knelt beside Sarah's grave one final time, carefully placing the white roses back on the fresh earth. We did it, love, he whispered. We finally remembered how to stand up. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear through the breaking clouds, each one representing a human world where people had heard what happened here today. The galaxy would remember that humanity had not forgotten how to say no, and that sometimes the greatest victories were won not with weapons, but with the simple courage to do what was right. The funeral was finally over, but something new had begun.